Demolishing the colorblind approach in Canada. How can we fix a problem when people don't think there is a problem? Hello, teachers of Ontario. My name is Joy Kienge. I am a fourth-year student studying social and personality psychology at Carleton. My main objective for this presentation is to aid in raising awareness on the stain of Canadian history and to advocate for future implications of change. Many have forgotten the history that Canada was founded on. Maybe this is due to the lack of awareness on these matters or limited teachings on racial history in the education system. Well, instead of trying to understand why there hasn't been enough talk, we can move on and make a change. Although before we go any farther, let's educate ourselves on the matter of race and racial discrimination in Canada. According to Samuel and colleagues, racialization as a social construct was used to group people in racial categories established by physical appearance, social aspects, and cultural backgrounds. Hence, the construction of race is racist within itself because it ignores that multiple ethnicities cannot be put in a singular race category. For example, Chinese lived experiences are different those of Indians, yet they are grouped in the same Asian group. Racial discrimination is a multifaceted phenomenon that elucidates oppression. It is driven by the systematic privileges of the dominating white group and the oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC communities, individuals. Racial discrimination manifests in many forms, such as race-based transgenerational trauma, everyday discrimination, and structural experiences of discrimination. To emphasize, an individual does not have to be present at the same time of an event for them to be affected by racism. Put simply, trauma from one generation can affect and transfer to future generations. Furthermore, everyday discrimination involves discrimination in interpersonal relationships, such as daily harassment, unfair treatment, and insults due to skin color. Mistreatments in services and interactions may look like receiving less courtesy, poor services, and being followed in stores. The structural and systematic racism in Canada has leaked into Canadian discriminatory policies, resources, regulations, and practices. And it is not just something that a few people practice, but it affects all our lives in its social, economic, and political ways. Canada has a history of causing harm and suffering to Indigenous people through the acts of colonization. Residential schools was a church-run, government-funded organization designed with the purpose to strip the cultural identity of the child and continuing the action of assimilating through eliminating the Indian problem. In the same way, in 1942, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were uprooted and disposed of from their homes in British Columbia for war. Later, the government sold their ownership, homes, farms, businesses, family heirlooms to other Canadian families, British Columbian families, without their consent. The effects of the benefits and losses are still present today. To take a brief look at the history of Black Canadians. The history of Black enslavement in Canada has been effectively erased from the national conscious. Canadian students believe that slavery was an American problem linked to Canada only the Underground Railroad, despite a history spanning more than 200 years of slavery on Canadian shores. Classrooms are ill-equipped due to difficulties with structural forces which include suppressed knowledge, miseducation, and the problem of locating and learning Black histories. Canada's past continued to hold an untroubled, even celebratory, white settler colonial logic. Canada engaged in the slave trade, enslaving African peoples from at least 1628 and continued until the British Crown abolished the practice in 1834, more than 200 years later. At its height, more than 4,000 Black people were enslaved in the territories that are now known of Ontario, Quebec, PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Black enslavement was no less brutal in Canada than the United States. Black people faced physical, emotional, and social violence and were separated from their families. Practices justified by a racial ideology in which Black people were cast as animals and thereby considered property. In many ways, the history of Black people in Canada mirrored the lives of Black people in the United States, down south. While slavery's abolished in Canada took place decades earlier than the United States as a whole, the last segregated school was not closed until 1983. However, there is a distant difference in the visibility of that experience, which continues to render Black Canadians' experiences invisible. From the point of view of many Canadians, Canada's relationship to and responsibility for slavery begins and ends with the Underground Railroad. However, that is far from true. Built-in inequalities of generations of racism does not just disappear. The effects of unapologetic racism form Canada's history and continues to affect racialized people's mental health, resulting in the use of substances to cope with generations worth of racial trauma. Racial trauma symptoms are identical to PTSD symptoms. However, racial trauma differs from PTSD due to the constant impact of racial discrimination. The concept posed attributed to PTSD does not totally mirror racial trauma because social oppression is continuous for BIPOC communities. The repercussion of racial trauma caused by racial discrimination is both historical and ongoing. It's like going through life when the odds are against you. Although racial discrimination is highly visible in Canada, there is a shortage of research compared to the United States. Awareness of the extent of racial discrimination leads to more Canadian government aid. However, without enough data, the ability of fully understanding the problem and its consequences is jeopardized. Daily discrimination is associated with mental health issues, for example, general anxiety disorder, depression, suicide, and suicide ideation. Racialized populations also encounter daily racial microaggressions, which are gestures, behaviors, and verbal or nonverbal indignities like suspicious glances, assumptions of second-class citizenship, or criminality. intentional or unintentional. It expresses disdain to racialized individuals. Although microaggressions might seem trivial compared to covert racial discrimination, Salami and her colleagues inform that individuals find it easier to identify, recognize, and react to covert racism than microaggressions, which has an equal effect on mental health. However, it is difficult to examine the mental health impacts of racial discrimination in Canada due to the apparent lack of data, leaving room for unawareness, confusion, lack of accurate help, and potential stereotyping. Research shows that racialized populations are less likely to seek help with mental health problems in Canada due to language barriers, past negative experiences, relatability, and remoteness of mental health resources. However, COVID-19 has changed this direction. Although barriers in accessing mental health resources still exist for BIPOC communities, there is a shift that white Canadians are seeking mental health care less often than marginalized groups. This communicates a level of desperation for BIPOC individuals to find help despite mental health resource barriers.
We're talking about how anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and other forms of racism are actually embedded in our government and in all of the institutions that our Canadian government allows to exist.
Political leaders across Canada have rushed to condemn systemic racism in the aftermath of protests condemning the way Canada governs and polices marginalized populations. But activists warn that without understanding what systemic racism is, the people at the very heads of those systems are just talking the talk without walking the walk.
We don't have a Canada without the Indian Act. We don't have a Canada without residential schools or the reservation system. We don't have a Canada without slavery and segregation and all of the things that those produced.
Akwasi Owusu-Bempah says systemic or structural racism is baked into Canada's history. Systems developed during the colonial era colored who had access to education, who could gain wealth, and who could hold political power. Those systems continue to have lasting impacts with results that are still felt today.
Things like school disciplinary practices, the ideas and beliefs that were propagated and shared during those times influence how teachers perceive children's behavior. They influence how employers perceive the potential intelligence or work ethic of job applicants. And they influence how, organizations that I study, like the police, decide who they're going to stop and search.
Today, Black women are one of the fastest growing Canadian prison populations, despite making up a fraction of the population. And the Conference Board of Canada reports Black Canadians earn only 80 cents for every dollar white Canadians earn. Author and activist Desmond Cole says while the Prime Minister has talked a lot about systemic racism, his government has sued to stop a Human Rights Tribunal ruling on funding for Indigenous children in care.
The Human Rights Tribunal has said exactly what I just said. This is racist. It's not fair to give First Nations kids on reserves less money, and the government has to immediately equalize the funding. What has Justin Trudeau been doing instead? He has been fighting First Nations people in court so that he doesn't have to equalize the funding.
Now, Cole was able to provide a long list of examples of Canada failing to address systemic racism or indeed benefiting from it, most recently failing to obtain the consent of the Wet'suwet'en people before attempting to build the Coastal GasLink pipeline through unceded territory. In Ottawa, Xiaoli Li, City News.
To help prevent the previous implications, Canada needs to eliminate colorblind policies in different sectors and encourage public involvement to minimize racism. The colorblind approach ignores the consequences of racism. It is the belief that there is a race neutrality in Canada. For instance, the colorblind notion emphasizes that opportunities are the same regardless of race, social and economic disparities, including the lack of racial data collection. Sinet and colleagues argue that the colorblind approach may explain the high rates of depression in racialized communities because it ignores and silences the victims of racial discrimination. Canadians adopt the viewpoint that they don't see color. They describe themselves as tolerant and diversity-minded, though this is far from true. This false ideology of inclusiveness causes the Canadian government to excuse their lack of interventions in the reports of racism made by BIPOC individuals. This filter depicts a national, white settler colonial narrative that confirms what Canadians feel. They feel morally superior, or we, Canadians feel morally superior to our racist cousins in the South, America. The history that is often told to Canadian children is that colonial Canada was an open, welcoming place for Black people to find sanctuary and live free of the racism in America. In ways big and small, Canadians attempt to identify themselves in contrast to Americans. If Americans are bashed and travelers, Canadians are considerate and mindful. If Americans are wrongdoers, Canadians are peacemakers. If Americans are racist, then Canadians must not be. There's a call to action. Students deserve to hear marginalized voices and understand the true effects of history. We must learn about history to make sense of the present, so Canadians might be more knowledgeable. In what ways, you might be wondering? In no way do I mean to expose the vivid, harsh details to elementary students due to their age. However, like a study by Corey Wright-Malley mentions, we need to ensure all voices are seen, heard, and that history is told as it happened, not as we wish it could have or would have liked it to be. An Indigenous participant in this study expressed the impact on the blockage of misrepresenting history and Canadians' goodness mythology had on students. As a Métis, he says, I am saddened to think how little I learned about Indigenous people in school. I often feel ashamed of being Métis. I avoided discussing that part of myself to avoid the comments that came along with telling anyone. This participant goes on to say, to effect change, we need to learn from the past. The stories and truth from the past impact our future. Canadians should be taught and held accountable for the parts of our history that we often overlook and ignore. There is a need to learn about these problems and to make a change. As teachers, you have the responsibility to open the eyes of students and be honest with them about our country's history and what marginalized people have been through and go through. We need to educate our children so they don't fall in the same patterns as we did. It is important to be open and honest during these discussions. It's something we all must learn to make a change. Now, white teachers, you make up predominantly the populations of teachers. Hence, you are principal actors to reshaping this colorblind narrative and Canadians' consciousness from recognizing and acting upon racism. As teachers, there are many ways that you can educate yourselves in these matters. You may draw from Black historical societies, Library and Archives Canada, Momentums, memorials, museums, media websites such as Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Being Black in Canada, historical publications such as Canada's History or Kayak, the National Film Board of Canada, official professional associations, and teacher advocacy groups. There are plenty of resources that you have to educate yourselves in these matters. However, resources are not sufficient alone. There is a need to alter teaching practices. There's a need to restructuring the original framework of speaking about racial issues. I am aware that sometimes these conversations are uneasy for some of you due to a lack of practice. Hence, I would like to demonstrate how you can deal with these certain situations. I'd like to invite 2 elementary participants to demonstrate what you might face in real situations. Now, these 2 students pretend this is a white boy and a young Black girl. They're sitting in class, and you happen to overhear something that is very unusual, not the regular norm that you hear in class. So I'm going to ask the crowd if one of you can come up and demonstrate to us what you would do in this certain situation.
Excuse me, I would like to volunteer.
Yes, ma'am, you can come on in. And what is your name?
My name is Miss Kienge.
Hello, Miss Kienge, nice to meet you. So demonstrate to us how you would deal with a situation that occurs like this.
Why is your hair like that? Is it fake?
In this situation, if it were to occur in my class, I would have told the young gentleman to remove his hands from the young girl's hair, and I would have told him that he shouldn't comment on other people's appearances, whether it's not a big deal or is, and that he should respect other people's boundaries and not just touch people without asking permission.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for that example, Miss Kienge, and these 2 lovely people. Thank you so much. Just grab your chairs. Thank you, loves. And please, can you applaud for them? This was an example of a microaggression. Many students face this every single day, whether big or small. As teachers, you have the option of ignoring it, telling the student to stop without an explanation, or explaining why it is a problem and why it shouldn't happen again. Remaining silent does nothing to correct these injustices or these ways of thinking. It is important when you have a voice to use it. We need to engage meaningfully. I would like to invite the student that did the microaggression to come back on stage. This is one way deal with this situation. What you did is wrong. It's called a microaggression. Clara did not feel comfortable when you asked questions like that. It is important to respect boundaries of others. Though she might look different and have different hair from you, she deserves the same respect as you. People who look like her have been treated less than before and throughout history just because of how they look. We don't want to continue that way of thinking, do we? No. We know that everyone is equal no matter how they look like. Thank you. Another hand of applause, please. Thank you. You can just go ahead, take your chair. Thank you for that. This example addresses the current action and names it of what it is. It explains why what that student did was wrong, and that individuals that look different are treated differently, but should not be. We need to normalize talking about these historical events and the present issues that marginalized individuals experience in this society. This recognition of the linkage between past, present, and future is an important step in developing a historical consciousness. Moving educators, you all, elementary teachers, from surface levels of consciousness to deeper levels that are necessary to address and redress the inbuilt structures of the education system that will work against racism. Thank you.